County father has been found guilty in the murder of his 2-year-old daughter. A jury found Glenn Bates guilty of aggravated murder, and child endangerment. Closing arguments were heard this afternoon. The jury came back with their verdict 2 hours later.
It was Christmas of 2014. Peg Fontaine stood on the front porch of a familiar house, one she had visited many times before. She carried a bag of wrapped gifts, smiling with hope, ready to see the children she once cared for, but this time no one answered the door. Through the glass she spotted a figure, a little girl, barely moving, just standing there. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she didn't blink, she just stared. There was something in that moment, something deeply unsettling. Peg couldn't explain it, but she felt it in her chest. The child she had once known as joyful and energetic wasn't there anymore, not really. She left the gifts on the porch. She walked away, but that image stayed with her. What Peg didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this would be one of the last times anyone outside that house saw Glenora Bates. She wasn't missing, but she was fading from view, right in front of everyone. Glenora was just 2 years old, a toddler who had once laughed, played, and thrived in the care of foster parents who loved her like their own. She had been safe, stable, and growing. But the decisions made by a system meant to protect her would soon take her down a very different path. That holiday visit was more than a family check-in. It was a quiet alarm, a signal no one would recognize until it was too late. In the weeks that followed, the signs that something wasn't right became harder to ignore, but still, no one stepped in. Not until Glenora was brought to a hospital in a condition that left even experienced professionals unsure of what they were seeing. But by then, it was beyond the point of help. What happened to Glenora Bates would later be recognized as one of the most severe breakdowns in Ohio's child protection process. It revealed more than individual mistakes. It showed the ripple effect of missed signals and what can happen when oversight fails. This documentary will follow her journey from the bright early days in foster care to the missed opportunities to the final moments no child should ever face. Along the way, we'll examine the roles of those involved, the caregivers, the professionals, the investigators, and the institutions that had every chance to act but didn't. This is not fiction. This is a real case involving real people, a child who needed protection, a system that was built to provide it, and a community left grappling with how it all slipped through the cracks. Before we continue, please be advised, this documentary discusses sensitive events surrounding a young child and the decisions made on her behalf. While care has been taken to present the facts respectfully, viewer discretion is advised. If you believe in the importance of protecting vulnerable children, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps amplify the stories that need to be heard. By subscribing, liking, or sharing this video, you become part of a growing voice that says every child deserves to be seen and safeguarded. She was born in January 2013, earlier than expected. Glenora Bates entered the world at 34 weeks. She weighed just over 4 pounds. Medical notes from that day highlighted concern she was small for her gestational age, and certain prenatal conditions had gone unaddressed. No record of maternal checkups, no prenatal support. Test results pointed to exposure that raised immediate concern with local authorities. It didn't take long for action to be taken. Based on long-standing procedures, Glenora was placed into care within days. At the time, her mother, Andrea Bradley, had a prior record with social services. There were previous investigations. Support staff documented that intervention had occurred before. The case was reviewed, and Glenora's placement was confirmed. That's how she arrived at the home of Peg and Michael Fontaine. The Fontaines were experienced foster parents. They had already opened their doors to 4 of Glenara's older half-siblings and were known for consistency, patience, and care. The home was quiet, structured, and centered on healing. Glenara adapted quickly. Peg described her in those early weeks as bright-eyed and peaceful. "Our happy Buddha baby," she would later recall. Glenara smiled often. She began to grow. Her appetite was strong, her motor development on track, and she connected deeply with those around her. Photos from that time capture a child at peace, curious, responsive, and increasingly expressive. In just a few months, Glenara had reached every developmental milestone set for her age group. She became known for her laughter, her strong grip, her love of being held. The Fontaines kept detailed records of her growth. They attended all her pediatric checkups. Her well-being became their priority. They didn't see this as temporary care. They hoped, genuinely, that Glenara might become a permanent part of their family. As they nurtured her, they also began inquiring about the legal process. Adoption wasn't guaranteed, but based on her rapid progress and the consistent environment they had provided, they believed she might stay. They submitted formal interest to the appropriate caseworker. At the time, no final decisions had been made, but the Fontaines were ready to commit fully. Peg would later testify, "We loved her like she was ours." And Glenara, by all accounts, responded to that love in kind. For 8 months, she lived in that home. During that time, nothing suggested that her placement should be changed. She was active, she was healthy, she was forming strong, secure attachments, but reunification with birth parents remained the policy goal. The Fontaines understood the system. They knew the guidelines. But they had also seen firsthand what stability could do for a child, and they hoped more than anything that their efforts would be seen as more than just temporary support. Still, the process began to shift. There were reports filed about Andrea Bradley's progress. Case files were being updated. A court review was scheduled. No final ruling had come down, but for the Fontaines, the signs were hard to ignore. They continued to advocate for Glenara. They complied with every requirement. They made their home available for ongoing evaluation. They didn't step away. Even as questions about her future placement began circulating, they stayed committed. Because for them, Glenara wasn't just a file or a foster child. She was family. If you believe no child should be removed from a loving home without clear and compelling reason, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Because when the signs of safety are clear and the consequences of disruption are real, every voice matters. In September 2013, Glenara Bates and 4 of her siblings were sent back to live with their biological mother, Andrea Bradley. The decision was approved in Hamilton County Family Court after service records indicated compliance. Andrea had attended required parenting programs and maintained scheduled meetings with caseworkers. These steps were viewed as indicators of progress, and the court accepted the recommendation for reunification. The ruling included one stipulation: a 3-month period of observation. If no issues were reported during that window, the case would be closed. The Fontaines, who had cared for Glenara and several of her siblings in foster placement, immediately raised concerns. Peg Fontaine contacted the assigned caseworker and questioned whether the reunification was in the children's best interest. She pointed to previous history and expressed unease about the sudden transition. Her concerns were documented, but no delay was issued. The oldest sibling, however, was not returned to Andrea's household. Instead, that child was placed in the care of Dana Bradley, Glenara's grandmother. Dana had long been involved in the children's lives and was considered a source of steadiness. Still, she was not given guardianship over the younger children and had no decision-making authority for Glenara. Andrea's history with protective services stretched back several years. In 2009, a court ruling found fault in a prior case involving one of her children. That outcome led to a mental health assessment. She was diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder. After a brief hospitalization, she resumed care of her children under supervision. No further action was taken. By the time Glenara was returned in 2013, Andrea was no longer living alone. She had entered a relationship with a man named Glenn Bates. Records at the time did not list any disqualifying convictions against Bates. However, those familiar with the household later shared that his demeanor had caused concern. He was described as unpredictable, and some who knew the family questioned whether proper evaluations had been completed. Peg Fontaine made multiple calls to child services during this period. She informed officials that Bates was now present in the home with the children. She asked whether background checks had been conducted and whether additional oversight would be added. There is no public record of any new assessment being made. No home review was scheduled, no court hearing was reopened. The 3-month monitoring period came and went, and with no new reports submitted during that time, the case was closed. The reunification was considered complete. The agency signed off. From the system's perspective, the matter had been resolved. But what was documented in the file and what was happening behind closed doors would soon prove to be very different things. In December 2014, Peg Fontaine returned to the house on Hackberry Street. She came with a car full of gifts, planning to visit the children she had once fostered. It was a simple gesture, one rooted in care and consistency, but something wasn't right. When she knocked on the door, no one answered. She waited. Knocked again. Through the front window, Peg spotted one of the children. The little girl was just standing there, still, silent, watching. Peg called out. No response. No wave. No smile. She eventually placed the presents on the porch and walked away, unsettled by what she had seen. It wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling that something inside the home had shifted, and not in a good way. That same month, Glenara was taken to the hospital. According to medical notes, she weighed just over 17 pounds. That was more than 3 pounds less than her weight during foster care a year earlier. The change in growth trajectory was significant. She had also lost the ability to stand without assistance. She was admitted for observation. Fluids were administered, and nutritional intake was monitored. After approximately 10 days, she had gained some weight. Her discharge plan included feeding recommendations and a suggestion to follow up with outpatient care, but no mandatory report was filed with child services. Despite the significant weight loss and a documented history of involvement, the case was not flagged for reevaluation. No investigation was reopened. Glenara was released to her mother with only verbal guidance. In early 2015, Peg Fontaine filed another report. She couldn't let go of what she had seen at Christmas. She contacted authorities and shared her concerns. That March, a Child Protective Services worker was assigned to conduct a home visit. The result of that visit was brief and would later become central to public scrutiny. According to the report, the house was clean. The child appeared happy and healthy. No further action was recommended. The visit was documented and the file was closed. Officials later confirmed that no second opinion was sought and no medical follow-up was ordered as part of that visit. When the case became public months later, Hamilton County Prosecutor Joe Detters made a direct statement. We opposed her being returned from the start, and what happened afterward confirmed every concern we had. Following the investigation, Maura Weir, Director of Hamilton County Job and Family Services, addressed the agency's role. "We did not follow internal protocols," she admitted in a public hearing, "and because of that, key steps were missed." By every official account, Glenara should have been reviewed more thoroughly. She had previous involvement with the agency. She had lost weight. Reports had been filed, and yet none of that triggered renewed oversight. The red flags were there, but they weren't acted on. And when the final file was reviewed, it showed a conclusion that contradicted everything the child's history had already revealed. A system designed to intervene had closed her case with a single sentence. The opportunity to protect her wasn't lost overnight. It faded quietly over months of silence. On the morning of March 29, 2015, Andrea Bradley arrived at the emergency department at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. In her arms was her daughter, Glenara. Medical personnel were immediately called to respond. At first glance, something didn't add up. Staff described confusion about the child's age. Glenara appeared significantly smaller than expected. Her size and condition led some to believe she was an infant, not a 2-year-old. She was cold to the touch and unresponsive. Medical teams attempted standard resuscitation protocols. They checked vital signs, administered care, and reviewed her physical state. Despite their efforts, Glenara passed away at exactly 1 p.m. As required, the hospital alerted the Hamilton County Coroner's Office for further review. Dr. Karen Strait, one of the first physicians to examine Glenara, noted immediately that her overall condition did not reflect what would be expected of a healthy 2-year-old. Her appearance, body weight, and physical state prompted immediate concern and triggered a full-scale investigation. The case was assigned to Dr. Jennifer Scott with the coroner's office. During her assessment, Dr. Scott determined that Glenara's situation was not the result of a single isolated event. Her findings pointed not to a sudden incident, but a prolonged absence of proper care. Additionally, Glenara had sustained a head injury that had not been treated prior to her arrival at the hospital. The findings were escalated for official review. Dr. Lakshmi Kode Samarko, Hamilton County's chief coroner, later described the case as one of the most serious examples of ongoing neglect that she had encountered in her professional experience. She emphasized that it was not only the condition itself that raised concern, but the complete absence of medical follow-up prior to the hospital visit. As Glenara's case was entered into formal records, staff began reviewing her history. There were no recent pediatric visits listed, no records from urgent care, no calls from the home requesting assistance. Nothing in the medical system showed that steps had been taken to address the child's condition prior to that morning. What left the deepest impression on investigators and healthcare providers was not just what they saw, it was what they didn't see. There had been no warning from the caregivers, no attempt to seek help, no urgency. Time had been available, but no one had acted, and when that silence was finally broken, it was already too late to change the outcome. The questions began within hours of the hospital report being filed. Detectives Marcus McNeil, Bill Hilbert, and Eric Karigaloff started with the person who had been in the home with Glenara during her final hours, Glenn Bates. In the first interview, Bates appeared emotionally distant. He described Glenara as having looked tired and cold and claimed he had no idea what was wrong. He said she had eaten, gone to sleep, and never woke up. But his tone raised concern. Detectives noted how neutral he remained even when discussing what should have been an urgent event. When asked about visible concerns noticed at the hospital, Bates hesitated. Then, for the first time, he brought up something else. "We play this game," he said, "doggy gonna get you." According to him, it was a joke. He would chase Glenara around and lightly grab her with his teeth on the arm or side. Investigators pressed further. Bates admitted he may have bit too hard, but insisted it wasn't meant to hurt. Detectives paused the session and ordered a forensic dental comparison. Days later, Bates was brought in again. His story changed. Now, he said Glenara had experienced a fall a few days earlier. He claimed he had picked her up by her legs during a playful moment and that she had slipped and hit her head. He said her shoes had come off and she landed hard. When asked why medical help wasn't called, Bates said Glenara seemed okay and Andrea had handled it at home. That statement immediately raised concern. Investigators asked how the wound had been treated. Bates replied, "Just regular thread, like sewing stuff. Andrea fixed it. He said it was small and didn't seem serious, but he couldn't explain why they hadn't called a doctor or gone to urgent care." Andrea Bradley's interview followed shortly after. She was read her rights and asked to describe the days leading up to March 29. Andrea said Glenara hadn't been feeling well and that they had tried giving her fluid. When asked about the injury, she acknowledged closing it herself with items from the house. She didn't explain why professional care hadn't been sought. As the conversation continued, she mentioned that Glenn could be controlling and that she wasn't sure how serious the injury was. She believed Glenara would rest and recover. Meanwhile, forensic results returned from the lab. Bite pattern impressions were reviewed and matched to both Glenn Bates and Andrea Bradley. Experts confirmed that the spacing and angles aligned with adult teeth and that the patterns were consistent with the reports investigators had heard. Dr. Jennifer Scott, the Hamilton County Deputy Coroner, performed Glenara's examination. She documented a combination of new and older signs that pointed to ongoing harm. According to her findings, the child's condition indicated a prolonged absence of adequate nutrition and care. She noted that the injury to Glenara's head, based on the tissue response and appearance, had occurred roughly 24 to 48 hours before she was brought to the hospital. It had not been treated properly and had shown signs of infection. Dr. Scott also noted that the injury was inconsistent with a simple fall. The location and depth raised the likelihood of forceful contact. She documented that the child had experienced more than one prior injury that had not been professionally addressed. The location and condition of the wound did not support the idea of a simple accident. Dr. Scott documented that the contact appeared forceful and that it was not consistent with an ordinary fall. Her report also noted other prior concerns that had not been addressed medically. Police requested a third interview with Glenn Bates. This time, Bates altered his version once more. He still claimed Glenara had fallen, but added that she slipped harder than he expected. He said she cried briefly, then stopped. When asked why emergency help wasn't sought, he stated that Andrea didn't think it warranted it and they didn't want trouble. Detectives found inconsistencies. Over 3 interviews, they had heard 3 different explanations. None aligned with what the forensic evidence showed. Then came the statement from Glenara's older sister. She was 10 years old. During her interview, she told detectives that the injury happened the night before the hospital visit. She told investigators she witnessed Glenn Bates lift Glenara by the legs and make forceful contact between her and the wall. Afterward, Glenara had been quiet. No one called for help. Her account was detailed, and it matched both the timeline and Dr. Scott's medical analysis. Presented with this statement, both Bates and Bradley chose not to provide further comment. Hamilton County Coroner Dr. Lashmi Samarco later reviewed the full report. In a televised interview, she called it a case of persistent neglect, emphasizing that the real issue wasn't a single event, but the absence of response over time. Every layer of the investigation pointed to the same conclusion. This wasn't an unpredictable emergency. It was a series of chances to intervene, each one missed. There had been time, there had been signs, but instead of action there was silence. Investigators compiled the case step by step. There were no assumptions, no guesses, just facts, timelines, contradictions, proof. And when all of it came together, the picture was clear. In October 2016, the courtroom of Judge Robert Ruhlman delivered its verdict in the case against Glenn Bates. After weeks of testimony, forensic review, and witness accounts, the jury reached a unanimous conclusion. In October 2016, Glenn Bates was convicted of aggravated murder by a Hamilton County jury following a full trial and presentation of forensic and testimonial evidence.
After receiving this type of trauma, you're not going to be crying, you're not going to be eating, you're not going to be walking, you're not going to be doing anything. All you're going to be doing is dying. And that's what happened in this case.
The conviction, under Ohio law, allowed for the most severe form of sentencing available at the time. The recommendation, capital punishment commonly referred to as the death penalty. Judge Ruhlman confirmed the jury's decision, formally sentencing Bates to the highest penalty permitted by the state. According to court notes, Bates showed minimal emotion as the sentence was read. Prosecutors argued that the consistent pattern of inaction and neglect warranted the full weight of the law. Years later, that decision would be reversed. In 2023, the sentence was overturned following a successful appeal. The appellate court ruled that the original trial was compromised by juror selection issues, including the seating of a juror with documented racial bias. This procedural error was deemed sufficient to invalidate the original sentencing phase. Rather than proceed to a second capital trial, Bates accepted a plea agreement. Under its terms, he was resentenced to 25 years in prison with credit for 8 years already served. This adjustment means he will be eligible for supervised release later in life, pending parole board review. Andrea Bradley, Glenara's mother, never stood before a jury. At the time of her arrest, she was in the later stages of pregnancy. During pre-trial hearings, her defense presented documentation showing that her cognitive assessment placed her below the legal threshold for capital sentencing. As outlined in precedent set by the U.S. Supreme Court, individuals with intellectual disabilities cannot be subjected to the most severe sentencing options. Andrea entered a plea of no contest and was sentenced to 15 years to life. When asked if she wished to address the court, she responded, "Give the world what it wants. I don't care." Her demeanor was noted in official records, but no additional statement was made. The most impactful voice in the courtroom came from a child. Testimony from Glenara's 10-year-old sister was presented under protected status. While her words were not shared publicly, sources close to the courtroom confirmed that her detailed account of events had a strong influence on jurors. According to court officials, her recollection aligned with the timeline and played a key role in establishing critical facts. Also present was Bonita Crum, Glenn Bates's mother. She addressed the court during the sentencing phase. Through tears, she asked for understanding, saying her family was deeply affected and would continue to support her son. She spoke not in defense of what had happened, but from a place of grief shared by many in the room. As the final sentencing orders were read aloud, the courtroom remained silent. No disruptions, no outbursts, just a quiet acknowledgement that a long and difficult case had reached its legal conclusion. But for those who had followed Glenara's story from the beginning, that silence was more than just a moment. It was the sound of consequences delayed, but no longer denied. Following the conclusion of court proceedings, the focus shifted from the individuals involved to the agencies entrusted with oversight. At the core of public concern was Hamilton County Job and Family Services, the agency responsible for evaluating the home Glenara was living in. The case had been officially closed weeks before her condition brought her to the hospital. That decision and the broader handling of her case prompted internal reviews and consequences. 2 employees assigned to her case file resigned from the department. 2 supervisory officials were placed on suspension. While no legal action was taken against agency staff, the department cited policy lapses and a failure to meet established standards during internal evaluations. The agency acknowledged that protocol had not been followed as required. Glenara's case was not shelved. It became a focal point in retraining efforts. Her file was used in internal sessions aimed at improving the identification of overlooked warning signs. Staff were retrained on procedures related to home assessments, caregiver reviews, and response timelines. Glenara's experience became part of an internal case study meant to reinforce the consequences of missed intervention opportunities. No new legislation was enacted as a direct result of the case, but Glenara's name surfaced repeatedly in local government hearings. County-level committees reviewed reunification procedures and oversight practices, using the case as an example of what happens when the system loses visibility into a child's safety. Dana Bradley, Glenara's maternal grandmother, pursued a federal lawsuit against the agency and named employees. The complaint alleged that Glenara was returned to an environment that had not been adequately reassessed. The case reached a settlement out of court, with the resolution kept confidential. Advocacy groups, including the Ohio Children's Alliance, highlighted Glenara's story in statewide awareness campaigns. They called for stricter safeguards before reunification and for ongoing monitoring when prior risk had already been established. In a public statement, then Agency Director Moira Weir addressed the case with uncharacteristic directness. "We didn't meet our own expectations," she said. "We were supposed to ensure a safe environment, and we didn't do enough." The response did not undo the outcome, but it did force the system to confront its own blind spots, and from that confrontation came a hard truth. Prevention doesn't start with tragedy. It starts with accountability. Neglect doesn't always show itself clearly. More often it hides in silence. A child who suddenly grows quiet, a student who stops making eye contact, missed medical visits, a shift in energy or engagement. These are signals, subtle but real, and they matter. In situations where something feels off, taking notice can make all the difference. Most states support anonymous reporting. You don't need proof, just a concern rooted in observation. That concern alone can initiate a check-in. It might be the one moment that shifts everything. Families and guardians must evaluate caregivers carefully. Familiarity doesn't guarantee safety. Whether it's a relative, partner, or trusted adult, every caregiver should be viewed through the lens of consistency, stability, and proven care. For educators, neighbors, and community members, awareness is protection. Behavior patterns, attendance, and sudden emotional withdrawal can be early cues. Staying observant doesn't require intrusion. It simply means staying alert. They should be the reason we all remain watchful. If you believe in protection that goes beyond policy, in prevention that starts with observation, and in voices that carry weight even after they're no longer heard, then share her story. Not for the numbers, but for the awareness. Because for Glenara and for others in quiet danger, visibility is the first step to protection. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Tremors, or his arms would shake.
Okay.
And his legs would jerk. He had sweats, and he liked to be held at all times when he wasn't asleep or in his mama room. I was holding him.
Andrea Bowling had completed every requirement asked of her to open her home to a child in need. 40 hours of training, health screenings, substance evaluations, a federal background check, and a full home inspection. These were the boxes the system demanded be checked. But what made Andrea truly stand out wasn't what could be listed on a form. It was something more rare and far more powerful, a heart ready to love without limits. She welcomed Dylan into her life without hesitation, hoping to give him what every child deserves: a safe space, a nurturing environment, and the presence of someone who genuinely cared. But despite all her preparation and good intentions, Andrea was unable to shield Dylan from what he had previously gone through. The challenges he had faced before entering her arms were part of a reality that even the most caring individual couldn't undo. In a world where paperwork often outweighs human instinct, Andrea stood as a quiet force of compassion. For Dylan, those 12 days in her care weren't just a chapter, they were a revelation. A small window in his 77-day journey where the cold routines of bureaucracy were replaced by warmth, softness, and human connection. During that brief time, he was wrapped in love, not just blankets. He was cradled not just by arms, but by purpose. And while his earlier days had been filled with uncertainty and hardship, those last days were shaped by affection and safety. Andrea couldn't fix the system. She couldn't undo what had already shaped Dylan's earliest experiences. But what she could do, what she did do, was give him something to hold on to: peace, comfort, and the knowledge that he mattered deeply to someone. Take a moment to like, subscribe, and share your city and time in the comments below. Every interaction helps push this story further, allowing it to reach those who believe every child deserves a voice. In a weathered trailer tucked away in the small town of Otway, Ohio, lived a family that seemed, at first glance, to be living a simple working-class life. Daniel Groves, 41, held a job at the rural King Farm supply store. His wife, Jessica Groves, 39, had once worked as a licensed practical nurse. Together, they had a teenage son, Daniel Jr., and to those looking in from the outside, there was nothing unusual about their lives. But just beneath the surface, there were hidden complications, realities that didn't match the ordinary picture they presented. Daniel had a prior history with the justice system and was currently navigating court supervision tied to a past incident involving store property. Despite the legal requirement to undergo regular screenings, he often manipulated the process, even involving his own son in maintaining a facade of compliance. These efforts painted a troubling picture of someone working harder to conceal problems than to solve them. Jessica, once known for her bright energy and dedication to her profession, was now struggling with personal challenges of her own. Her medical license had quietly expired in October 2018, and questions remained about when she had last practiced. By mid-year, both she and Daniel appeared to be facing serious health and lifestyle setbacks, drawing them into a pattern of dependence that steadily altered their lives. This wasn't just a story about a family with a few stumbles. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling, where small red flags became larger and quiet concerns became unmistakable. What lay ahead would reveal how appearances can mislead, and how systems designed to step in sometimes arrive too late. By mid-October 2018, Jessica began to sense that something was shifting. At 5.5 months pregnant, she felt the subtle signs of new life, an awakening that, for her, came with unexpected weight. It was only then that the reality of her situation began to take full shape. Her teenage son, Daniel Jr., had already noticed the growing tension in their home. At just 14, he had seen more than most boys his age: his mother's visible health struggles, her absence, her changes in behavior. He didn't have the words for all of it, but he felt the uncertainty. And like many in his shoes, he held on to the quiet hope that a new baby might bring something different, maybe even something better. On the morning of January 10, 2019, Daniel and Jessica arrived at Southern Ohio Medical Center as another quiet winter shift began. By 5:25 a.m., it was clear that Jessica was approaching delivery. She was already in the final stages. But something about the moment felt off. Nurse Darian Lice, seasoned and observant, immediately picked up on what others might have missed. Jessica's posture was unusually withdrawn, her gaze distant, her cooperation minimal. She declined to answer key questions about her prenatal care and declined to provide a requested sample for standard testing. The most puzzling sign was her lack of reaction. Despite being fully dilated, a stage that typically brings discomfort and intense physical response, Jessica remained still, almost emotionless. The medical team, concerned about both her well-being and the baby's, proceeded with a clinical alternative to obtain the necessary health information. What they found raised serious concerns. The results indicated the presence of prohibited substances, confirming fears that had already been forming among the medical staff. This wasn't just a routine delivery, it was a moment marked by questions, tension, and a growing awareness that what had just begun might soon involve far more than a simple hospital discharge. Daniel sat quietly in the corner of the hospital room, his gaze heavy with thoughts he didn't dare speak aloud. He seemed uneasy, as if something far larger was weighing on him. But Jessica's presence kept him firmly in check. The staff noticed. There was tension in the air, the kind that signals a deeper truth hiding beneath the surface. As Jessica's delivery approached, Daniel finally leaned forward, his voice barely audible. With hesitation, he revealed something critical. Jessica had used heroin just 2 days before coming to the hospital. His admission brought a deeper sense of urgency to the already concerning situation. Soon after, Dylan James Groves entered the world. Born a month early, he weighed just 5 pounds, 10 ounces. Medical staff quickly moved to stabilize him, providing support to ease his breathing. But initial tests raised immediate red flags. Dylan's system tested positive during routine screenings, and further lab work confirmed that he had been exposed to multiple controlled substances before birth. Even from his first breath, Dylan's small frame showed signs of intense withdrawal. His limbs trembled, and his tiny muscles responded unpredictably as he tried to adjust to his new surroundings. Staff noted that his cries were faint and difficult to hear, barely rising above the soft hum of the medical equipment. Those quiet sounds, gentle, almost hidden, left a lasting impact on the nurses present. One would later say she had never seen a newborn work so hard just to find peace. Despite his fragile condition, Jessica never once asked to see her son. There were no check-ins, no visits, not even a call. After 2 days, she was released from the hospital. Dylan, still under observation, remained alone in his incubator, watched over only by the compassionate hospital staff. And as days turned into nearly a week, his parents never returned. But Dylan wasn't entirely alone. The doctors and nurses became his temporary family, offering the kind of care every child deserves. They held him through his discomfort, adjusted his blanket when he stirred, and made sure he was never without a gentle hand. One photo from that week tells the story best. In it, Daniel Jr., just 14 years old, holds Dylan in his arms with the kind of tenderness that words can't describe. It wasn't the parents who stood by Dylan's side, but a teenage boy trying to shoulder a responsibility far beyond his years. When the time came for the hospital to plan Dylan's release, they made a firm decision. He would not be sent back with his biological parents. There were too many unanswered questions, too many concerns. Instead, a new figure stepped forward. Andrea Bowling. Andrea wasn't just another placement. She became the lifeline that Dylan didn't know he was waiting for. Her arrival changed everything. On January 15th, 2019, Andrea Bowling, a school teacher with a heart for service, received a phone call that would quietly reshape the course of her life. On the other end of the line was a request. Would she take in a newborn baby who needed urgent care? Andrea didn't hesitate. Her answer was immediate. Yes. What followed was a wave of compassion. The community around Andrea moved quickly, each person offering something from the heart. A cousin brought over a crib, a friend from church lent a high-tech baby swing, and neighbors pitched in with essentials. Within hours, Andrea had all she needed: blankets, diapers, tiny outfits, and most important of all, the unwavering support to give this child a chance at a better start. On January 16th, just after 6 p.m., Andrea arrived at the hospital to meet baby Dylan. The room she had prepared was ready: soft lights, clean linens, everything placed with care. She was ready to welcome him not just into her home, but into a space filled with stability and kindness. For the next 12 days, Andrea dedicated herself completely to Dylan. She took leave from her job and committed to being there around the clock. She described him as delicate and gentle, with expressive eyes that followed the sound of her voice. His hands trembled slightly and his legs moved restlessly, residual effects of withdrawal. But for the first time, he was in a place where he could truly rest. When Dylan stirred at night, Andrea was there to soothe him. When he whimpered, she wrapped him in warm blankets and sang lullabies that seemed to calm him. With each passing day, his movements grew steadier, his cries quieter. A sense of ease began to take root. And then, one day, something remarkable happened. Dylan smiled, a soft, unmistakable smile that lit up his entire face. It was a moment Andrea would never forget. That smile, brief as it was, became a symbol of the new beginning she had hoped to give him. Over the course of those 12 days, Andrea didn't just provide shelter. She gave Dylan a memory of what life could feel like. Her photographs from that time show a baby full of potential, wrapped in affection, and surrounded by people who believed in him. Though his time with her was short, those days were rich with meaning, and through her care, Dylan experienced what many children wait a lifetime to find: unconditional love. For 12 short but meaningful days, Dylan experienced the warmth and nurturing presence he had always needed. In Andrea Bowling's home, he was met with gentleness, stability, and a love that asked for nothing in return. But those days of calm were drawing to an unexpected and deeply emotional close. On January 25th, 2019, a meeting was held at the Coto County Children's Services Office. In attendance were Andrea, Dylan's biological parents, Daniel and Jessica, and social worker Patricia Kraft. Daniel shared that he had arranged a 6-month leave from his job at Rural King, stating he was prepared to assume full-time care for his son. The conversation then shifted to the expectations set by Children's Services. Both parents were reminded of the commitments they needed to fulfill: counseling, therapy, and adherence to court directives. These were non-negotiable steps designed to ensure a safe and supportive environment for any child under their care. Still, Andrea couldn't shake the unease growing inside her. She had spent nearly 2 weeks with Dylan, enough time to know what stability felt like for him. With concern in her voice, she voiced her fears to Patricia, specifically regarding Daniel's possible ongoing substance use. But Patricia, bound by policy and test results, explained that because Daniel had no official history of serious infractions and had recently passed a screening, they were preparing to reunite Dylan with his biological family. What Patricia didn't realize, and what Andrea quietly feared, was the flaw behind that test. No one had directly witnessed the screening procedure, and it would later be suggested that Daniel's teenage son had stepped in to provide the sample on his behalf. On January 28th, a day that would remain etched in Andrea's memory, she was asked to return Dylan. The moment was quiet but heavy. Dylan, far too young to understand, was leaving behind the only consistent care he had known. In his eyes, it was just another ride, another change in scenery. But for Andrea, it was something else entirely. With deep emotion, Andrea packed his things: a soft blanket he often curled up in, small toys that had comforted him, and carefully folded clothes she had chosen with care. She also included a letter, her contact information written clearly, her message simple: "If you need help, please call." "I said those words out loud," Andrea later recalled, "but deep inside I already knew I wouldn't be hearing from them again." Even then, Andrea couldn't begin to imagine what the coming days would bring, or how much was still hidden from view. Despite a signed agreement as stating that Jessica was not to return home without direct supervision from Children's Services, she moved back in that very evening. It was a clear violation of the terms, but the system's response was delayed. By February 4th, 2019, social worker Patricia Kraft arrived at the Grove's residence for a scheduled visit. During the check-in, Jessica held Dylan close and did not allow anyone else to handle him. He was wrapped tightly in multiple layers of blankets, his face the only part visible. This made it difficult to observe his overall condition. Patricia noted in her report, "The child is calm, with no visible injuries." But the assessment lacked key steps. She didn't lift him to check his weight, didn't remove the blankets for a more thorough observation, and didn't conduct the full evaluation protocol typically required during such visits. These basic procedures, though mandated, were not completed. The same scenario repeated itself during Patricia's next visit on February 25th. Jessica once again kept Dylan in her arms, and the review became little more than a procedural formality. No meaningful inquiry into his condition was made. From a distance, Andrea watched, feeling powerless. She had done everything within her reach to provide safety and speak up when it mattered. Yet the oversight continued. What could have been a critical moment for intervention, an opportunity to take a closer look and ask the hard questions, was allowed to pass without challenge. These missed moments would soon take on far greater significance. We owe it to Dylan and to children in similar situations to keep their stories alive. Subscribe to help share these voices and ensure these stories are never forgotten. In the quiet of the house, Dylan's cries were faint, soft sounds that barely filled the room. When social worker Patricia Kraft visited, Jessica offered a simple explanation. He has gas. It's normal. Patricia's report echoed the same surface-level observation. Child is clean, calm, weight 8 pounds, 9 ounces. But beneath that line was a troubling truth. No weight was actually measured, and no full examination was done that day. As March unfolded, the Groves family began to distance themselves from oversight. Doctor visits were skipped, court hearings went unattended, and phone calls stopped being returned. When Patricia reached out, she received text messages from Daniel, each message from a different number, each excuse more evasive than the last. One day it was a family emergency, the next a vehicle issue, or a health concern involving a relative. But beneath these scattered explanations, something far more concerning was developing. Dylan, then just 2 months old, was no longer thriving. Those close to the case would later describe his condition as deeply troubling. He appeared increasingly uncomfortable, and his cries grew more frequent, signals that something wasn't right. Jessica, dealing with her own personal challenges, appeared increasingly overwhelmed. Daniel, though fully aware of the tension in the home, failed to step in or reach out for help. On March 7th, Dylan was scheduled for an important appointment with Dr. Hudson. The family did not attend. The doctor's office followed up. Calls were placed, letters sent, but there was no reply. By March 28th, Patricia Kraft arrived at the home for what would become her final visit. Jessica, as she had during previous check-ins, kept Dylan in her arms and allowed no interaction from others. Once again, Patricia's report concluded without raising concern. Child is healthy, no injuries. But the truth, as later revealed by Dylan's teenage brother, painted a different picture. He would testify that by this time, Dylan appeared to have unusual markings and signs of discomfort, details that had gone unreported. When he asked about the marks, the parents offered a vague explanation, something about a fallen object in the room. That same evening would mark a turning point. It was the last recorded interaction tied to Dylan's care. After Daniel failed to return with Dylan, social worker Patricia Kraft sensed something was seriously wrong. She initiated an urgent search, returning to the Groves home daily, making repeated phone calls, and exhausting every avenue she could. But there was no trace of the family. On April 24, 2019, out of growing concern for the other child in the household, Coteau County Children's Services removed 15-year-old Daniel Jr. from school and placed him in the care of extended family. By April 30th, with the Groves having cut all communication, Patricia filed an official missing person report. Law enforcement now took over the case. On May 20th, Captain John Murphy of the local sheriff's department spotted Daniel and Jessica Groves riding an ATV near their property. He activated his sirens to initiate a stop, but the couple quickly disappeared into the dense surrounding woods, where patrol vehicles couldn't follow. Weeks later, on June 10th, authorities surrounded the Groves home with warrants in hand. Jessica answered the door and offered a statement that stunned investigators. Children's Services already took Dylan months ago. Leave us alone. This claim directly contradicted the agency's own missing person report. Jessica was taken into custody without resistance. Daniel turned himself in later that day. The next morning, detectives conducted interviews with both parents. Jessica remained closed off, her demeanor cold and unshaken. Daniel appeared visibly unwell during questioning. At first, both parents stuck to their story, that Dylan had been removed long ago. But under sustained questioning, Daniel eventually admitted otherwise. He stated that he had come home on March 28th and found Dylan had passed away in his crib, claiming no signs of injury and attributing the cause to natural factors. Later that evening, Daniel agreed to help investigators locate where Dylan might be found. A search team, accompanied by K-9 units, was dispatched to the wooded area near the Grove's residence. Daniel claimed Dylan had been placed inside a container, but was vague about the precise location. After several hours, the team found nothing, and it became clear he was leading them in circles. 2 days later, investigators made a calculated move. Daniel and Jessica were left alone in the interrogation room, their conversations secretly recorded. What unfolded was telling, not a discussion of their children, but of their pets and how the investigation might affect them. The emotional disconnect was startling. When confronted with the recording, Daniel finally changed course. On June 12th, he guided authorities to a concealed well in a remote, wooded area. It was more of a pit than a proper well, 30 feet deep, spring-fed, and inaccessible by vehicle. Firefighters had to transport equipment by hand. The team attempted to pump the water out, but it quickly refilled. In a last effort, they used hooks to probe the bottom. Eventually, something heavy was recovered. What emerged next was deeply unsettling. 2 plastic storage crates, bound with chains, secured by locks and fasteners. Inside the container, they found evidence connected to Dylan, concealed under layers of material and weighted with objects. The setup appeared designed to keep the container submerged indefinitely. News of the discovery spread quickly. The community responded with sorrow and disbelief. Andrea Bowling, Dylan's foster caregiver, organized a vigil in his honor, a final act of remembrance for a young life that had briefly known love, then slipped from reach. In the months that followed, Dr. Susan Brown conducted a follow-up clinical review of Dylan's case. The findings revealed a deeply concerning picture. At the time he was located, Dylan's weight was just 4 pounds, 8 ounces, significantly under what would be expected for a child his age. The medical team noted clear signs that he had endured sustained health deterioration, the details of which left a lasting impression on professionals involved in the case. On January 6, 2020, the trial of Jessica and Daniel Groves began. The courtroom proceedings spanned 5 days and were broadcast to the public. What unfolded gripped viewers not only due to the complexity of the case, but also because of the emotional distance exhibited by the parents during key moments. The hearings became a focal point for national attention, as testimony after testimony brought new revelations into the public eye. Healthcare staff from Southern Ohio Medical Center were among the first to testify. They spoke about Dylan's delivery and the visible medical concerns present at the time. Detectives Adam Giles and Captain John Murphy followed, sharing the intricate timeline of the investigation. Jessica Bird, a counselor specializing in substance recovery, and juvenile court official Greg Dunham both testified about the system's involvement and the responsibilities that had been missed. As each person spoke, the story slowly came into focus, layer by layer, revealing a reality that had remained hidden beneath a seemingly ordinary exterior. The trial moved forward with quiet but undeniable weight, as more evidence against Jessica and Daniel Groves came to light. One of the most emotionally charged testimonies came from social worker Patricia Kraft, whose face was blurred during the live broadcast. She took the stand twice, recounting the visits she made to the Groves' home and the missed opportunities to ensure Dylan's long-term well-being. Pediatricians Dr. Muhammad Ali and Dr. Greg Hudson also provided key testimony, followed by Dylan's foster caregiver, Andrea Bowling, who spoke about the care and comfort she had provided during the brief time he was in her home. But the most sobering account came from firefighters Steve Gamil and Dan Shai, the team who had conducted the final recovery mission. They brought with them a set of images that left the courtroom in heavy silence. "This," said Dan Shai, motioning to an image, "is the crate as it rose to the surface." The team had used ropes and tools to retrieve it carefully, knowing how delicate the process would be. What followed was a slow, meticulous operation that revealed the depth of planning behind the concealment. Dr. Susan Brown, who had overseen the post-mortem analysis, delivered her findings with clinical precision. The physical indicators on his chest and arm, as well as a fracture in the forearm, were not consistent with natural causes, she testified. This pattern reflected a concerning history that required serious consideration. As the trial progressed, Assistant Prosecutor Julie Cook Hutchinson systematically examined Jessica's claims. When questioned, Jessica said the injuries had occurred on March 27th and that the following day marked the final turning point. But when pressed for clarity, her answers faltered. She could not explain how the injuries had occurred, nor why she failed to document the event, even though she had called it the worst day ever. The prosecutor continued, "You don't remember causing the upper arm fracture? You don't remember any of this?" Jessica responded with repeated claims of memory lapses. "I don't remember. I told you, I don't remember." The turning point came when Daniel's inaction was placed under the microscope. While his defense team claimed that panic had driven his decisions, the prosecution presented an image that told another story. An improvised container, held together with fasteners and weights, clearly assembled with care and time. "Does this look like panic to you?" the prosecutor asked the courtroom. That image, showing how everything had been sealed and placed, became a defining moment. It was not the picture of someone acting in haste. It reflected calculated choices. And in that silence, the courtroom seemed to grasp the reality. The child at the center of this case had not been met with protection, but with decisions that concealed rather than cared. On the evening of January 10th, 2020, the jury returned to the courtroom after hours of careful deliberation. Their decision came on a deeply symbolic date, what would have been Dylan's first birthday. The weight of the moment was felt by everyone in the room. A hush fell over the courtroom as the verdict was read aloud. Jessica Groves was found responsible on all 11 counts brought against her. Her sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 32 years. Daniel Groves, though cleared of the most severe charge, was found responsible on 10 other counts and sentenced to 47 years to life. Dylan James Groves lived for just 77 days, just over 2 months. Within that time, he experienced 12 days of warmth, care, and love in the home of Andrea Bowling, a woman who gave him the stability he had never known. For the remainder of his brief life, however, Dylan's environment was marked by uncertainty and missed chances. Days that could have been different if the warning signs had been taken more seriously. As the gavel struck, the courtroom was left with a sobering truth. Dylan's story became more than a timeline of events. It became a symbol of what happens when critical systems fail the most vulnerable among us. Rest peacefully, little angel Dylan. You are remembered not only for what happened, but for what your life continues to inspire. If you've stayed with us through Dylan's story, we encourage you to take a moment to reflect. Reflect on how systems can improve. Reflect on how communities must act. Stories like this are not easy to hear, but they are vital. Your support helps ensure they are not forgotten. We owe it to children like Dylan to carry their stories forward. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing, sharing, or leaving a comment. By doing so, you help amplify awareness and keep attention where it matters most. Thank you for watching. Your engagement gives voice to the unheard and helps shine a light where it's needed most. Stay with us as we continue to tell the stories that matter.
She showed what she was supposedly remorse for, but it wasn't true. She can cry all the tears she wants, but she deserves what she got. It's going to bring me a little bit of peace, but it's going to take some time for what she's done and what my brother has done.
The boy was lying still, unnaturally quiet for someone so young. His frame, frail and motionless, barely made an imprint on the floor. Eyes that once lit up at the mention of Pokemon and space shuttles now seemed distant and empty. First responders said the room felt cold in a way they couldn't explain, not because of the temperature, but because of the absence of life. And yet, this wasn't some hidden shelter overseas. This was a modest family home in a peaceful Utah neighborhood. He hadn't been missing. There were no urgent press briefings, no flashing alerts. He was there the entire time, right inside the house, hidden just beyond the reach of those who might have helped, while the world outside went on, unaware. When the truth finally surfaced, it was almost unimaginable, not just because of what had happened, but because of how many chances there were to intervene. Teachers noticed. Neighbors suspected. Reports were filed. And yet, Every concern echoed into a silence that never responded. This is not a story about a child who simply got lost in the system. It's about a boy who was seen repeatedly and still left in danger. And what's even more chilling? Those responsible weren't strangers. They were familiar faces, smiling in public, clocking into jobs, waving to neighbors. Behind closed doors, a very different reality unfolded, one that no one imagined or perhaps chose not to. In the months that followed, the courtroom would unearth a family dynamic so fractured it defied belief. Legal documents and testimonies painted a picture of control, manipulation, and prolonged silence, a picture that, once fully revealed, stunned an entire community. This case may be difficult to hear, not because of sensationalism, but because it highlights how silence can be just as damaging as action, and how warning signs, when ignored, can lead to consequences that can never be undone. If you're new here, we cover real cases that deserve attention, especially those the system tried to forget. Please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. To our loyal subscribers, your likes, shares, and heartfelt comments help give voice to these stories. We are deeply grateful. Now, let's begin the story of Gavin Peterson. Gavin Peterson was born on January 15, 2012, in Ogden, Utah. From his earliest years, he stood out for his gentle nature and inquisitive mind. Those who knew him described him as joyful and endlessly curious. He had a fascination with science, especially space, and could often be found talking about rockets, stars, and planets. He loved to learn. His favorite color was blue, and like many boys his age, he was passionate about Pokemon and video games. But Gavin wasn't just bright, he was kind. He had a quiet way of making people feel at ease. Teachers later remembered how eager he was to help his classmates. At home, he had a natural sensitivity to the emotions of those around him. Gavin was the youngest of 3 siblings. His older brother Tyler had unique needs due to developmental challenges, and his sister Melanie often stepped in as a nurturing presence to both of her younger brothers. There was a closeness among them, built during their early years when they all lived under one roof with their mother and father. His parents, Melanie and Shane Peterson, began encountering serious challenges during Gavin's early years. In 2014, when Gavin was just 2 years old, a situation prompted law enforcement to conduct a welfare check at the family home. Officers noted that Gavin had been found outside without supervision, which raised immediate concerns. A further review of the home revealed conditions that were considered inappropriate for young children, prompting involvement from state authorities. The findings led the court to take protective action. All 3 children, Gavin, his older sister Melanie, and his brother Tyler, were placed in the care of other family members while an official case was opened. Melanie was issued a plan by the court, which included completing parenting courses, undergoing assessments, and participating in support programs designed to improve the stability of her household. To her credit, Melanie complied. She enrolled in every class, met with the necessary professionals, and completed her obligations without delay. Reports show she maintained consistent contact with her caseworker and worked actively toward meeting the expectations outlined by the court. However, reunification decisions can be slow-moving, especially when multiple agencies are involved. Despite her efforts, the timeline to regain custody continued to stretch. By the time her case reached a point where custody could be reconsidered, circumstances had shifted. The children had transitioned into the care of their father, Shane, and during this period, Shane had entered a new relationship. His partner, Nicolee Scott, gradually became a central figure in the home. Nicolee Scott's presence was, at first, unremarkable. She moved into the family's life quietly, offering support and appearing committed to the responsibilities that came with caring for 3 children. Gavin was only 3 when Nicole became a regular part of his world. What followed over the years would not be marked by dramatic events visible to the outside, but by gradual changes that would later be revealed through testimony, records, and lived experience. When Nicole Scott entered the Peterson household, she did so without drawing attention. There were no visible signs of tension, no major disruptions. On the surface, she appeared to be taking on a step-parent role in a household, adjusting to new custody dynamics. But over time, her role expanded, quietly at first. Then, with growing intensity, Nicole gradually became the primary authority figure in the home. What began as helping with routines and responsibilities soon evolved into firm control over the children's daily lives. Within a year, she was overseeing school schedules, setting house rules, and managing how the children interacted with others, including their mother. Milani, the eldest sibling, became the focus of increasing restrictions. As she grew into adolescence, she questioned Nicole's growing authority. In response, Nicole intensified supervision. Milani later shared with investigators that rules became more rigid. Access to personal items was limited, and communication with her biological mother was closely monitored. Surveillance systems were installed in multiple rooms. Every move within the home was carefully tracked. Tyler, the middle child, received noticeably different treatment. Nicole appeared to favor him, offering extra privileges and easing restrictions. According to statements made later in the case, Tyler was subtly encouraged to monitor his siblings and report their behavior. Over time, this approach widened the emotional gap between the children and increased their reliance on Nicole's approval. By 2019, Nicole's influence was deeply embedded. She began managing household routines to the point where even simple activities like mealtimes, phone use, and attending regular school functions became heavily controlled. Around this time, Melanie, the children's mother, began raising concerns. During scheduled visits, she observed changes in Gavin's demeanor and overall well-being. In February 2020, she captured photographs to support her concerns and submitted them to the Division of Child and Family Services. Rather than launch a formal inquiry into the environment Gavin and his siblings were living in, the agency suspended Melanie's visitation rights. Records later revealed that Nicole had filed a counterclaim stating that Melanie's concerns were baseless. DCFS responded by putting visitation on hold pending further review. That review never came. By the close of 2020, both Milani and Melanie were effectively removed from Gavin's life. Milani, his older sister, had long been one of his strongest sources of comfort, but over time, her relationship with Nicole grew increasingly strained. What began as quiet tension escalated into a pattern of control that left Milani isolated. As the situation became more restrictive, Milani made the decision to leave, hoping to reconnect with her mother and find stability elsewhere. That decision led to a serious turning point in mid-2019. Following an attempt to leave the home without permission, Milani faced consequences that drastically altered her daily life. She was no longer allowed to attend school and became increasingly cut off from outside contact. According to her later statements, she felt unable to express what she was experiencing, and attempts to reach out went unanswered. The defining moment came during Memorial Day weekend in 2019. Milani had been asked to complete yard work, something she was accustomed to doing. While using a lawnmower, she accidentally broke a sprinkler. Nicole was reportedly asleep at the time, but Shane Peterson, their father, witnessed the incident. Milani anticipated a lecture or a trip to replace the part. Instead, Shane instructed her to get into the car. They drove in silence. Instead of going to a store, Shane brought her directly to her mother's residence. Without offering a reason, he dropped her off and left. Melanie later described the moment as jarring. Melani's appearance had changed, and her energy was noticeably different. She opened up about the difficulties she had faced in the home, and her mother immediately contacted authorities. A report was filed with the Weber County Sheriff's Office. The Department of Child and Family Services was also notified following the holiday. Although Melanie was now living with her mother, no formal intervention followed. Despite multiple reports and repeated attempts to escalate the matter, no substantial review was conducted. Melanie remained in her mother's care from that point forward. Gavin, however, stayed behind. The bond he shared with his sister, one built through years of shared experiences and mutual support, was severed. With Melanie and Melanie now outside the picture, those closest to Gavin were no longer present in his daily life. And inside the home, the environment continued on, with fewer eyes watching and even fewer willing to question what was happening. In the final months, Gavin was seen outside the home. Quiet signs of concern began to emerge. These weren't dramatic events or high-profile alerts. They were subtle observations, noticed only by those who were paying close attention. And in the places Gavin still had limited interaction with the world, those quiet concerns started to surface. During the 2022-2023 school year, Gavin's teachers began to see small but noticeable changes. He was always a quiet child, but now his energy had faded. His attendance became irregular. He appeared more withdrawn, and staff began to notice shifts in his mood and physical presence. These weren't accusations, just concerns, unspoken but shared. Inside the school cafeteria, one worker named Jan became quietly watchful. She noticed Gavin's habit of standing near the trash bins after lunch. At first, it seemed like a child stalling or throwing something away. But after watching this happen more than once, John began to realize that he wasn't loitering. He was looking for something. Discreetly, she started covering the cost of his school meals herself, topping up his lunch account so he could have consistent access without drawing attention. For a time, it was the only certainty in his school day. That changed when Nicole contacted the school. She demanded to know why Gavin had been receiving meals without her knowledge. She stated firmly that if he was to be provided lunch, she would handle the cost directly. After that phone call, Jan and the staff were instructed not to interfere, and shortly after, Gavin was removed from school altogether. In August 2023, Nicole informed the school district that Gavin would now be homeschooled. No further explanation was offered. After that, Gavin was no longer present on school rosters, and staff who had quietly watched over him had no way to reach out. He had disappeared from public view entirely. For nearly a year, there were no updates, no records, and no interactions that might have prompted an outside check-in. Gavin's world had become fully private, with no institutional oversight. Those who had once tried to help now had no way of knowing what was happening behind closed doors. In early July 2024, a text message was sent by Tyler Peterson, Gavin's older brother, to their father, Shane. The message expressed concern that Gavin wasn't acting like himself, that something seemed off, that he appeared unusually quiet and unwell. It wasn't a medical opinion, but it signaled that something had changed. The response from Shane did not result in urgent action. Within the same week, an urgent call was placed to 911 from the Peterson home. Emergency personnel responded and found Gavin in a state that required immediate medical attention. When officers arrived at the Peterson residence on July 9, 2024, they were responding to a call for medical assistance. Paramedics were already tending to Gavin, but something about the scene prompted closer attention. The environment inside the home felt unusually restrained. Details that typically align with daily life were missing, and initial explanations didn't fully line up with what police observed. Within hours, detectives from the Weber County Sheriff's Office opened a formal investigation. As they walked through the house, they found areas that seemed out of sync with what had been described. One bedroom, in particular, appeared nearly empty, lacking in comfort, personal items, or signs of normal use. The room was said to be where Gavin had been staying while feeling unwell. The initial walkthrough raised more questions than answered. Investigators expanded their search and quickly identified several disconnected surveillance cameras throughout the house. While not unusual for security purposes, the placement of these cameras raised questions. They were small motion-sensitive devices, recently removed from their locations but still operational when tested. Later, a shed in the backyard revealed where the missing equipment had been stored. Alongside the cameras were phones and memory cards that had been wiped or relocated. Investigators secured the devices and began a digital analysis. What emerged from the data was revealing. Text messages recovered from the phones included conversations between Nicole, Shane, and Tyler discussing household restrictions placed on Gavin. One message referenced limiting his access to meals as a form of discipline. Another discussed securing his bedroom door during certain hours. While these texts alone were not definitive, they indicated that Gavin's day-to-day life had been tightly regulated. Further analysis uncovered deleted files from surveillance apps, video segments that had not been fully erased. They showed extended footage of Gavin alone in a nearly bare room with minimal activity over long periods. The content lacked clear context, but the pattern of isolation was evident. These digital records became a crucial part of the investigation. During the search, officers also found a small quantity of unauthorized substances stored in the kitchen. This discovery led to additional charges unrelated to the primary case but reinforced concerns about the overall environment. As interviews continued, inconsistencies began to surface. Nicole and Shane provided varying accounts of when Gavin last appeared ill, what he had eaten, and how long they had been monitoring his condition. Each retelling introduced new timelines, and the lack of alignment between their statements raised red flags. At the medical facility, doctors completed an initial evaluation and reported that Gavin's condition reflected a long-term health decline associated with severe nutritional deprivation. Though further analysis would follow, physicians confirmed that these issues had developed gradually, not suddenly. At the time of admission, Gavin weighed less than 60 pounds, a measurement well below the expected range for someone his age. Hospital staff with decades of clinical experience quietly noted that this level of deterioration was rarely seen in typical settings. The focus of the investigation now shifted. It was no longer just about a single incident. It had become a search for how this situation unfolded over such a long period, and why every opportunity to intervene had fallen short. The legal proceedings that followed Gavin's case unfolded over several months, drawing close attention from the public, legal community, and child advocacy professionals across Utah. The Second District Court in Ogden became the setting for a series of formal hearings that exposed decisions, failures, and a household dynamic that had largely gone unchecked for years. Shane Peterson, Gavin's father, was the first to face the court. In March 2025, he entered a plea of guilty to multiple felony charges, including an offense defined under Utah law as causing harm leading to loss of life due to prolonged neglect. As part of his plea deal, prosecutors agreed not to pursue elevated charges. On May 6th, Judge Camille Nider sentenced him to an indeterminate term of 5 years to life in the Utah State Prison. Shane declined to speak at sentencing, offering no personal explanation. Tyler Peterson, Gavin's older brother, was also charged in connection with the case. His situation, however, was addressed with additional layers of review. Tyler was evaluated by 2 court-appointed mental health professionals, both of whom determined that his decision-making and behavior were influenced by clinical factors requiring long-term care. With the agreement of the court, Tyler entered a guilty plea to reduce charges and was released under structured supervision. He was placed in the care of his mother, Melanie Peterson, with mandatory mental health treatment and ongoing monitoring. Nicole Scott, the stepmother at the center of the case, initially denied involvement, but by April 2025 she changed her plea. She appeared in court and admitted guilt to multiple felony charges, including obstruction and offenses involving the prolonged mistreatment of a dependent child. The hearing lasted less than an hour. Nicole did not offer a public statement. Prosecutors described her actions as part of an intentional pattern of controlling behavior. During sentencing, Judge Nieder addressed Nicole directly. Her statement was pointed and measured. She referred to Nicole as the primary force behind Gavin's prolonged suffering, drawing a sharp comparison to conditions historically associated with extreme deprivation and control. The courtroom remained silent as the judge made clear that this was not a case rooted in poverty or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate breakdown of responsibility. The most emotional moment came when Melanie Peterson took the stand. In her victim impact statement, Melanie spoke about the bond she shared with her younger brother. Her words were calm but deeply personal.
Manipulated me into hating my mom. She called me names every day. At that time, I was mostly focused on surviving. They would starve me until I was really skinny.
She described the helplessness she felt after being separated from Gavin and the weight of knowing she couldn't return to help him. Her voice did not waver, but the pain in her testimony was unmistakable. Her statement left a lasting impact on those present. The prosecution emphasized the long timeline of missed opportunities, reports filed, warnings raised, visits requested but not acted upon. The defense acknowledged the facts presented and asked the court to weigh the circumstances surrounding each defendant's mental and emotional condition. But the evidence was clear, and the court had no difficulty reaching a resolution. By the end of the spring term, all 3 individuals charged in connection with Gavin's case had entered guilty pleas. Legal accountability had been delivered. But the full impact of what happened in that home extended far beyond the courtroom. For those who lived it and those who had only just begun to understand the scope, the reckoning had only begun. In the aftermath of the courtroom proceedings, a deeper examination revealed another layer of accountability, this time within the systems designed to protect children. Gavin's case wasn't hidden. It was documented. He had been the subject of multiple official reports at least 7 separate times, filed with Utah's Division of Child and Family Services. These reports came from school staff, extended family, and others who had observed changes or voiced concern, but time and again the response was limited. Cases were closed without follow-up or marked unsubstantiated, leaving no further obligation for investigation. Educators saw the signs. Gavin's behavior shifted, his presence at school grew inconsistent, and staff noted a decline in his participation and well-being. But procedural boundaries prevented them from taking direct action. Without a visible injury or clear disclosure, they had no grounds to demand deeper review. When Gavin was formally withdrawn from school in August 2023, oversight ended altogether. Utah's homeschooling laws do not require in-person check-ins or educational monitoring unless specific red flags are triggered. In Gavin's case, no such flags were officially recorded, despite a growing history of concern. For DCFS workers, the legal threshold for home visits remained high. Without a new complaint or clear evidence of immediate danger, there were no tools in place to override parental authority, even when older reports suggested patterns of concern. Meanwhile, Melanie Peterson continued to pursue legal avenues. She filed motions, submitted appeals, and contacted agencies directly. But with limited access to current records and no custody rights at that stage, her influence was legally constrained. As the timeline became public, so did a devastating question. How could a child be mentioned this many times in official records by different people in different settings and still go unseen when it mattered most? July 19, 2024, a quiet vigil was held outside the Peterson home. Community members gathered under the evening sky, some holding candles, others bringing handwritten signs and photographs. Many had never met Gavin, but they were there for a reason. Teachers, neighbors, school cafeteria workers all stood together, marking a moment that had changed their town. The local response soon reached the state level. Utah Representative Christine Watkins introduced House Bill 83 legislation aimed at expanding DCFS authority. The bill proposed allowing the agency to seek emergency court orders for wellness checks when repeated reports went unresolved. It was designed to give frontline workers a path forward in cases that fell into procedural limbo. Despite strong support from child welfare advocates and educators, the bill stalled in committee in January 2025. Lawmakers raised concerns about due process rights and agency resources. For many following the case, it felt like another door had quietly closed. In the wake of the decision, the director of DCFS issued a public statement promising to reassess internal response protocols and explore alternative solutions. Media outlets across the country covered the case, and Gavin's name became tied to a broader conversation about what visibility really means and how responsibility must extend beyond documentation. The vigil, though small in scale, symbolized something larger, a shift in awareness, a shared realization that silence, whether institutional or personal, can carry a cost. And while the legislative effort may have paused, the conversation had only begun. Gavin Peterson's story is not one of being overlooked. He was noticed, his name was spoken, concerns were raised. What failed him wasn't awareness, it was follow-through. In the end, Gavin wasn't lost in the shadows. He was failed by a system that paused when it needed to act. His case challenges common assumptions about safety. Gavin lived in a quiet neighborhood. There were no public disruptions, nothing that on the surface would prompt urgent alarm. And yet within that routine exterior, decisions were made that slowly pushed him out of reach. Not because no one knew, but because the mechanisms designed to respond didn't move fast enough. There are key lessons here, ones that can't be ignored. Serious mistreatment can occur anywhere, even in stable-looking homes. Oversight matters. Homeschooling, while valid for many, must include appropriate checks when prior concerns exist. School staff need more authority to escalate red flags when they appear. And trust, especially in caregiving settings, must always be paired with verification. Familiar roles do not guarantee safety. If something doesn't feel right, say something. Say it early, say it again, and most importantly, follow it through. Protecting a child doesn't begin when harm is confirmed. It begins when doubt first arises. Subscribe, share, and help elevate the voices that too often go unheard. Silence may feel neutral, but in cases like this, it can be the very thing that allows harm to continue unnoticed.